Hello and welcome to the World Socialist Website's online forum, the COVID-19 Pandemic, Capitalism, and the Making of a Social and Economic Catastrophe. It is now clear that the world is experiencing the greatest outbreak of infectious disease in at least a century. Over 30,000 people have already died. Starting from less than 100,000 cases last month, the number of people infected worldwide is set to overtake 1 million this week. This forum will explore the social roots of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the historical and political issues arising from it. It will present a program for the working class to defend its social interests and those of humanity in response to the ignorance and apathy of capitalist governments all over the world. My name is Andre Damon. Participating in this forum will be David North, the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist Website, and the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party. David North has played a leading role in the international socialist movement for 45 years. His many published works include The Heritage We Defend, The Crisis of American Democracy, In Defense of Leon Trotsky, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, The Frankfurt School Postmodernism and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, and A Quarter Century of War. Joseph Kishore is the national secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and the party's candidate for president in the 2020 elections. Dr. Benjamin Mateos is a U.S. physician who has contributed articles to the World Socialist Website and is the author of dozens of articles on the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, Johannes Stern is a leading member of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, the Socialist Equality Party in Germany. David North and Joe Kishore are joining us from Detroit, and Johannes is joining us from Germany. So let's begin. Dr. Mateos, could you inform us of the latest developments?
Good morning, Andre, and thank you for letting me participate in this phenomenal forum. I think it's very important for our audiences to understand why this is such a monumental event. The World Health Organization had some words to say at the G20 meeting, and I think the numbers they offered were quite sobering. And I'd like to remark on those before we begin. Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus had said basically that the first 100,000 cases took about 67 days. The second 100,000 took 11 days, and the third 100,000 took just 4 days, and the fourth 100,000 just 2 days. As I was trying to prepare for this meeting, I made a note that COVID-19 cases were at 658,000 globally, with 30,000 deaths. This places the crude fatality rate at about 4.6%, which is on par with where Wuhan was at the time of their initial epidemic. They were facing a massive health crisis. And presently there are about 199 countries and territories that have been impacted. So you can see that in 3 months, this virus has spread throughout every part of the globe. And I just looked at the data again. We passed 700,000, essentially 40,000 cases with 2,700 additional deaths. I mean, these numbers and reports read like a wartime chronicle when daily killed and action lists were being promulgated during the wars. Now, if you go back and look at the trajectory of this pandemic, we're set to reach the 1 million threshold by the first week of April. And by the second week in April, we can potentially expect to see 10 million. And by the first part of May, up to 100 million cases, which is astronomical. Certainly, U.S. and U.K. are the epicenter of the pandemic, and arguably the United States is going to exceed Europe in the direction it's going. For instance, yesterday, we were at 120,000 in the United States, and as of this morning, that number has climbed to 131,000, and we have added 525 new deaths yesterday. And certainly, New York accounts for most of these, with 40% of the cases, but this is quite a remarkable development insofar as that the healthcare systems are completely overwhelmed in the regions where they're affected. Now, though the fatality index in the United States is 1.66%, there seems to be some socioeconomic factors that are giving us an assessment that there may be regional differences. For instance, in Louisiana, the fatality index is up to 4.3%, and in Michigan, it's closer to 2.5%, while in New Jersey and in New York, we see it at 1.2%.
Now, Joe, the United States is at the center of this epidemic. All of this is taking place in the midst of an election year. How do you see this crisis in relation to the political situation in the United States?
Well, I think that it can be said that this is true internationally, but it's true above all in the United States, that it has exposed the absolute inability of the capitalist system to respond to this in a scientific, rational manner, and one which corresponds to the interests of the working class. Just to give an example, the New York Times published a story this morning in which they note that a program to start ventilators, to start producing 40,000 ventilators, began in 2007. And this was 2007, then 2008. It was contracted to a private company. And then it took years before anything was produced. And by the time anything was, they were actually going to start production, this company was bought up by another corporation, and they shut it down. They closed down the production of life-saving ventilators because they considered them unprofitable. But if you consider, I mean, why is it that American society, and for that matter, capitalism internationally, has proven so incapable of responding to this? It's because everything has been subordinate to the interests of the corporate and financial elite. I mean, in the United States, which is the center of global ideological and political reaction, for 40 years, the ruling elite, more than 40 years, the ruling elite has subordinated everything to the endless accumulation of wealth, of funneling of money into the markets. And this is really the product of that, the absence of social infrastructure. I mean, this is a country in which 400 individuals own more wealth than 64% of the population, or 209 million people, where the rich live 20 years longer than the poor. Now, this is the reality of American capitalism, and in which everything has been subordinate to the interests of profit. And the response to the pandemic has been conditioned by the same considerations. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, the fact that nothing was done, the complete lack of preparation, and then, of course, the delay in responding on the question of testing, the fact that you don't have emergency production for healthcare infrastructure. I mean, it's the response of the ruling class. And of course, in terms of the politics, I mean, you have the Trump administration, which is the embodiment of the corporate and financial oligarchy. I mean, you watch his press conferences where he's parading around corporate CEOs as the heroes of the country, refusing any responsibility. Of course, you know, the immediate response of Trump was to deny that this was even a serious problem. Then it became an opportunity for them to hand out massive sums to Wall Street. And now, of course, the line from Trump is, well, we have to get everyone back to work. You know, the response to this has been determined by the interests of the ruling class. But of course, it's not just Trump. You have, I mean, the Democratic Party, what it has been talking about for the past 3 years. The greatest threat to the United States, to the American people, is what? Vladimir Putin and Russia. And now we have this massive pandemic which threatens the lives of thousands, tens of thousands, if not millions of people. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party joined forces in passing this bill through Congress, which passed unanimously in the Senate and with a voice vote in the House of Representatives, which we'll perhaps have an opportunity to talk about it in greater detail. But the main significance of this bill is that it hands out $454 billion through the Treasury Department to Wall Street to finance $4 trillion in buybacks, in the funneling of money into Wall Street. Just this month, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve increased by $1 trillion. And by the end of the month, consider this. The amount that is going to be funneled into Wall Street is approximately equal to the entire gross domestic product of the United States in 1 month. It would be as if all of the products and services produced in the country were just turned over to Wall Street. I mean, that is the response of the ruling class, a corporate boondoggle, whatever benefits are available to workers and the majority of the population are stopgap measures. But this is the response of the ruling class to this. And I think that there will be political conclusions drawn. We're having this meeting. This crisis is developing under conditions of immense political radicalization. What already has begun over a previous period is now going to be vastly intensified. The growing interest in socialism, the growth of social movements and popular protests. But this has to acquire a conscious political form.
Well, on the significance of this event, David, you've written on the World Socialist website that the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic is an event of, quote, immense historical significance. Could you elaborate on this?
Yes, Andrew, thank you for having me. The pandemic has exposed in a highly concentrated form the economic, the social, political, cultural, and even moral bankruptcy of a society based on capitalism. Now, the pandemic, you might describe it as a trigger event. In this sense, it is comparable to the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914, which set into motion the chain of events that culminated in the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. The assassination itself did no more than determine the date of the war's outbreak. The war itself, that is, the present crisis, no doubt the pandemic as a biological phenomenon poses an immense challenge to society. But the possibility, even the inevitability of such a contagion has been recognized for a long time. The really historical character of this event, as Joe has indicated, arises out of the response to the pandemic, the manner in which it has so completely exposed the comprehensive failure of the existing society, the ignorance and inhumanity of its political leaders, the corruption and venality of its ruling class, the incompetence of its institutions, and the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of its phony media-created heroes and even phonier values. Now, the pandemic will at some point end, but even after the virulence of the pandemic recedes and people emerge from isolation, there will be no going back to what existed before. The illusions that have persisted for so long have been shattered in the same way they were shattered by World War I and World War II. What has occurred cannot be undone. The lives that have been lost as a result of the gross absence of preparation, which is the consequence of the subordination of human need to profit, all of this will not be forgotten. The change is already underway. You might have noticed that people are cheering healthcare workers, not bankers. There's not going to be a return to the status quo ante. Millions of people all over the world, having passed through this uniquely global experience, will perceive and think about reality in a different way. In brief, capitalism has once again become, as it was in the aftermath of World War I and World War II, a dirty word. This crisis, I believe, will intensify and accelerate a global political crisis, socialism, and socialism of a very serious kind, the type of socialism of Lenin, of Trotsky, of Rosa Luxemburg, not the nonsense of Bernie Sanders and other historically and politically insignificant people. Real socialism will again emerge as a mass movement all over the world, and most powerfully and explosively within the United States.
Well, to that end, Joe, there have been a whole series of actions at workplaces throughout the United States including at auto plants that have forced the shutdown of the big three automakers. How do you see this developing in the coming period and the working class response to the pandemic?
Well, I think that, yes, first of all, there have been we have been remarking over the course of the past several months the growth of working class struggles all over the world. We wrote a perspective on the World Socialist website at the beginning of this year, in which we spoke about the decade of socialist revolution begins, and called attention to the wave of mass unrest that had already developed, it was developing internationally. In fact, the strategists of the bourgeoisie have been talking about this is the era of the leaderless revolution. And this pandemic now, I think, really brings us to a new qualitative stage. Growing anger in the working class among young people is intersecting now with a global crisis, which is demonstrating in concrete form the consequences of a society that is based upon the interests of the rich, which is subordinated to profit. And there have been waves of struggles already developing. As you point out, the auto industry, the only reason that production was shut down, and this was covered up in the media, the only reason the production was partially shut down, not completely, in the auto industry is because workers took it upon themselves to launch sick-outs, wildcat strikes. There have been actions by Amazon workers, by poultry workers, by sanitation workers, transportation workers. On Monday, there's a planned strike by Instacart workers, grocery delivery workers who are still working and not being provided the most basic protective equipment. So I think this will generate, and is already generating, immense social anger. I mean, the line of Trump, and it's not just Trump, it's also the New York Times and Thomas Friedman, as we've written on the World Socialist website, is that we have to get everyone back to work as soon as possible. At his press conference the other day, he was going on and on. We have to go back to work. They want to go back to work. We have to go back to work. And they want to try to do that. But that's not going to be, it's not going to happen without resistance. I mean, there is going to be a response in the working class. The social anger, which has been developing over a longer period, will acquire more immediate forms. And that, you know, I mean, how that develops, I think the critical question is the development within the working class of a political leadership, and understanding, as David was saying, that, you know, this is a question of capitalism. I think there is a growing understanding among workers, among young people, of that reality. But that has to be organized. There has to be the development of a real political leadership in the working class in the United States and really all over the world.
I think there's also a growing realization among workers and the population more broadly that there's no national solution to this global pandemic. So with that, I'd like to bring in Johannes to speak on the situation in Europe. What's the significance of an international response to this?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for having me from Europe. Let me first make some points on the situation in Europe before I speak about the significance of an international response. One has to say, and that's of course known, that the situation in Europe is absolutely dramatic. The numbers are increasing by the day. There are now hundreds of thousands infected throughout the continent. Over 20,000 people have died so far. In both Italy and Spain, where the situation is worst, every day now close to 1,000 people die. In Italy, I think the death toll this morning has reached 10,000. In Spain, 1,500 have died so far. In the UK, in 2,300 people have died. In the United Kingdom, over 1. And also here in Germany, from where I am speaking, numbers of cases are now close to 60,000 people infected. And also the death approaching now 500. with figures rising faster than in the days before. The medical situation is catastrophic. I'm sure a lot of listeners have seen the pictures coming from Italy and Spain, where you have doctors decisions who is treated, who is not treated. There are not enough ventilators. The hospitals are completely overwhelmed by the amount of, and a similar development is now expected in other. I just read before the meeting started an interview by the head of the Robert Koch, an interview in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, and he's now warning about a similar in Germany. He said in the interview, we cannot rule out the possibility than ventilation stations in this country. We must expect that that's clear. This dramatic situation points really to it by the European governments, points to the significance of an international and scientifically planned solution. Other speakers have already addressed the political issues. It's a crisis which has been prepared. You know, there has not been a preparation by the European governments. On the contrary, despite the fact that this was known, that such epidemics can develop, there were massive cuts in the healthcare system. I mean, I could give a lot of numbers, but basically in all the European countries, hospital beds were cut, especially special care beds were cut. Also in Germany, it was a very dramatic development after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the past 30 years, the restoration of capitalism in Eastern Germany. I think 35% of hospitals alone in the former eastern part of Germany were closed down. Then after the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, you had massive austerity implemented all over the continent, while trillions were being funneled into the pockets of the holders. Healthcare was in Greece. There's basically none of them after the cuts which were implemented. It's really the question of socialism, national solution. The European Union is completely incapable of advancing even the most limited. The first thing France and Germany did was to implement export bans on necessary medical equipment like masks or gloves to other countries. And the packages they have now put together here in Europe, what Trump is, trillions are going to the big companies, to the banks, and nothing is really spent on medical care. No hospitals are built, no ventilators are built. The production is not really, now oriented to these necessary things, medical items which are needed. It's all done to, remain the profit system going, poses the need for a socialist planned response to the crisis. We have written, as you said, a number of important statements on this. I think a very significant statement was the statement we published on February 28th under the headline, let me find it, for a globally coordinated emergency response to the coronavirus pandemic. I just want to maybe quote one or two sections. Listeners can read the whole statement, but I think it sums up very clearly, what we understand and what really the significance is of an international response. We state, the response to the coronavirus cannot be coordinated on a nation-by-nation level. The virus does not respect for visa and immigration. The global networks of transportation and economic integration have turned problem.
So I have to apologize. We unfortunately are having some connection issues with Johannes. This is a new technology that we're seeking to implement. So there are a few hiccups, which I have to apologize for. Unfortunately, Johannes, your connection is breaking up a little bit, so I think we're going to have to move on. I did want to note the fact that there are people participating in this online forum from Scotland, Sri Lanka, Germany, Hungary, Puerto Rico, Denmark, Turkey, the UAE, Bulgaria, Serbia, Britain, the United States, and Costa Rica, just to name a few. I also wanted to take a moment to appeal to our listeners for support. Building a mass socialist movement in the working class requires resources. We need to expand the readership of the World Socialist website and introduce millions more workers to the revolutionary program in every part of the world. You can make a donation today by clicking the donate button on your screen if you're on the World Socialist website. We're not funded by banks and corporations, but by workers and sympathizers like you. And we'd like to thank all of our current financial sponsors. To all listening, please contribute as much as you can to help amplify this revolutionary program. So I'd like to just begin by asking a question to any of you. On Thursday, Donald Trump said that it was impossible to predict an event such as the one now unfolding. He previously had said that the crisis was an unforeseen problem that came out of nowhere. It was something that nobody expected. And yet, the World Socialist website has documented countless warnings by global health authorities on the dangers of just such a pandemic. Could any of you speak on this or elaborate a bit?
I'm sure. This is Benjamin. I think that almost every authority in Europe, Asia, as well as the United States has spoken to the next pandemic. I think they have, in the most clearest terms, highlighted a novel coronavirus, a novel virus, possibly an influenza virus that would be a pandemic. And they described this scenario in alarmingly accurate detail, one that would ravage every country, cause mass socioeconomic strife, loss of job, attack on the healthcare system, political crisis. And despite every warning by every authority, the capitalist nations have done nothing in preparing for such a development. It is remarkable that the amount of resources that can be devoted to this is minuscule compared to the crisis we're seeing in the markets. And as we have noted, it's predominantly because everything is to the markets, to the financial oligarchs, and nothing to the workers. I think we've said, millions may die to save billions. I think that's a very accurate assessment of how these producing nations see these developments in society.
If I can make a few points about this. The claim that this is an unforeseen event is nothing less than absurd. It is hardly an unforeseen event. There was the SARS pandemic in 2002, 2003. The very name of that pandemic, SARS stands, I believe, for severe acute respiratory syndrome, was well known. Even the type of effect such an infection would have on the human body. There was the SARS episode. There was the H1N1 event of 2009. There have been, as Dr. Mateos has indicated, many documents and warnings made that a pandemic would occur. I just want to read from a very valuable article that was published in the authoritative Foreign Affairs magazine, was published by the Council on Foreign Relations in the July-August 2005 edition. And the author is the well-known specialist in epidemics and pandemics, Laurie Garrett. And she wrote at the time, let's read a few passages. If the relentlessly evolving virus becomes capable of human-to-human transmission, develops a power of contagion typical of human influenzas, and maintains its extraordinary virulence, humanity could well face a pandemic unlike any ever witnessed. And then, in describing the impact, he wrote, the CDC, that is the Center for Disease Control, predicts that a, quote, medium-level epidemic, unquote, could kill up to 207,000 Americans, hospitalize 734,000, and sicken about a third of the U.S. population. Direct medical costs would top $166 billion, not including the cost of vaccination. An H5N1 avian influenza that is transmittable from human to human could even be more devastating, assuming a mortality rate of 20% and 80 million illnesses. The United States could be looking at 16 million deaths and unimaginable economic costs. This extreme outcome is a worst-case scenario. It assumes failure to produce an effective vaccine rapidly enough to make a difference, and a virus that remains impervious to some anti-flu drugs. But the 2007 reckoning is clearly a conservative guess. There is also, even far more recent, in 2009, a document produced by the National Security Council entitled National Strategy for Countering Biological Threats. So the claim that this is not known, that this is a bolt from the blue, is not only absurd, it's a lie. And what's very striking in all the commentary which presently takes place and what dominates the media, there's always this talk of, well, here we are now, but absolutely no discussion of responsibility, no discussion of how it is possible that the richest country in the world cannot provide even the most basic equipment required to treat patients, to protect caregivers. And the reason why this is ignored is because to begin raising these questions would discredit not only individual politicians, not just the psychopathic Trump and his entourage, but it would, like such events tend to do in history, it would discredit an entire social system. After all, during the past decade, public attention, or at least in the media, has been focused on the rising market, the levitation of the Dow Jones and the S&P and the NASDAQ is looked upon as the real proof of the success and viability of the American capitalist system and the world capitalist system. In other words, the celebration of the grotesque accumulation of personal wealth. But in the meantime, while this grotesque accumulation of wealth was taking place, society as a whole was being deprived of the resources which it so desperately requires. And so this event, and it could have been another event, it just happens to be this event. This event has exposed quite dramatically the fraud and bankruptcy of the capitalist system. And that is not something which is going to be lost on the American people or people throughout the world. You know, Donald Trump's statement, America is number one again. Well, it's number one in the number of people dying now of a pandemic. You know, that's how his prophecy has been fulfilled. So I think the consequences which flow from this are going to be colossal. Now, of course, it's going to take a certain period of time for working people, young people, to assimilate the lessons of this experience. It doesn't come all at once. But I think the impact of this, the manner, and we know that a revolutionary situation requires a profound change in social orientation. In a certain sense, the political consequences are there are consequences of a profound shift in social orientation. And I think this is what is taking place now. People have time to think. They're not, of course, under pleasant conditions, but they're watching what is taking place. They're observing a shattering change in the daily conditions of life. Trotsky, in his great History of the Russian Revolution, explains that a political catastrophe is generally the consequence of the confrontation of existing illusions which have persisted over many, many decades, perhaps even a century or more, with a sudden, uncontrollable eruption of reality. And I think this is where we are right now. And it's discrediting systems, it's discrediting political figures, it's discrediting parties, and it's discrediting systems of thought. Particularly, I mean, for example, let us take postmodernism, which it's with its claim that there is no reality, there is only an artificially, subjectively constructed narrative. Well, the pandemic is not a narrative, it's a reality. And this reality and the connection it has with the whole organization of our society is what's going to give rise to a profound change in the orientation of the working class. Social divisions are deepening by the day, even by the hour. I just read an article in the New York Times this morning, which speaks about the anger in France over the fact that the rich are retreating to their villas and various luxury locales, enjoying the fresh air, roaming through their large estates. In the meantime, masses of people are holed up in their apartments. And let's not forget there are countless of people who are homeless. There are migrants who are trapped in camps, which are centers of infections. There is the vast American prison population. There are those who are trapped on the American border. All of masses of people who are experiencing this reality as a catastrophe. And I think this is what more and more will come to dominate social thinking and politics. And I just want to say to those who are watching, I hope that you're drawing conclusions from this, not being simply spectators, but making a decision to become actively involved in socialist politics and build a movement in the working class, because that's the only force which can change the conditions which exist within society.
Just to add to David's point, I just wanted to take a moment to appeal to our listeners. You can, if you are interested in taking up the fight for socialism, you can submit an application to find out more about the Socialist Equality Party by clicking on the link on your screen. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, just on this question, Joe Biden was on this morning, Meet the Press, and in comments which were very, very mild criticisms of the Trump administration, he said something about how it was necessary to be ahead of the curve in responding to the pandemic. The fact of the matter is that not only was this foreseeable, it was foreseen. There have been dozens and dozens of reports about the danger of precisely such a pandemic. And on the specific question of ventilators, I'm speaking here from Detroit, and the Henry Ford hospital system, under conditions in which the pandemic is really just developing here, has already announced that they are going to be considering and implementing policies which may deny ventilators to people based upon their age and other considerations, essentially rationing care and forcing doctors to make decisions, the most horrific decision of all for a medical worker, who is going to live and who is going to die. But this is a product of an extreme shortage of ventilators, which will become even a greater consequences in the coming weeks. This has been an issue which has been the subject of reports going back for years and years. I just wanted to read one from 2003. And by the way, Trump said the other day, well, no one could have anticipated that we would to need tens of thousands of ventilators. I mean, it's a complete lie. 2003, the Government Accountability Office said, quote, few hospitals have adequate medical equipment, such as ventilators that are often needed for respiratory infections. There was a report, sorry if I could just get it, in 2017 from the CDC itself, which said it concluded that mechanical ventilators are essential for treating influenza patients in severe acute respiratory failure. Substantial concern exists that intensive care units might have insufficient resources to treat all persons requiring ventilator support. And Biden talks about we have to be ahead of the curve. The fact of the matter is the Obama administration, no less than the Trumps, the Democrats and the Republicans have done absolutely nothing to prepare the society for this disaster, which was foreseeable and foreseen.
If I could just interject, Joe, Len from online asks, what do you think the reason that the U.S. and other Western governments did not prepare for just such a foreseeable eventuality?
Because they were focused on handing over unlimited resources to the banks, the accumulation of wealth, military. In order to have financed a program to produce 1 million ventilators, it would have cost something on the order of $10 billion. In any rational society, this would have been mobilized immediately, resources coordinated to ensure that would happen. What has been instead? What was the Obama administration doing instead? Bailing out the banks, financing the military. $1 trillion for the military every year is 100 times what it would have cost to finance an emergency program to ensure a stockpile of a million ventilators in the United States. But that's not what they were doing. And it's the consequences of the policies of the ruling class, but it's a consequence more of capitalism. Just if I could add on the point that David was making about theories that are being refuted, the associated to postmodernism is the conceptions which have been promoted by the Democratic Party, by the organizations that surround it for decades, that the fundamental division in American society, world society, is not class, it's not social inequality, it's race, it's gender, the politics of identity, which have been utilized to advance the interests of privileged sections of the upper middle class as they compete for positions of power. Well, the coronavirus, Dave made the point that doesn't respect a boundary, it doesn't respect national borders, it doesn't apply for a visa, it also doesn't care what race you are, what gender you are. And of course the collapse of healthcare systems is impacting workers of all races, all genders. These are class questions, and that is being revealed in the development of this crisis.
Well, since you mentioned the issue of postmodernism, I just wanted to point our listeners to David's book, The Frankfurt School and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, which deals with many of these issues at length. These and many other works by David and other authors are available at Mehring Books on Mehring.com. So I just wanted to take a few more questions, some related questions from our listeners online. Jay writes, this is a hypothetical question, but wouldn't you have Obama, Clinton, Biden's response to this coronavirus crisis have been much more effective than Trump's? And a related question, Ebony asks, can you please talk about the stimulus package and how the government is only offering Americans a one-time payment of $1,200, which is virtually nothing? Perhaps Joe or David, would you like to take those?
Well, I could speak, I guess, initially. I mean, the fact of the matter is, again, that look, Trump embodies the reaction, the nature of American finance capital. He didn't come out of nowhere. This is an administration which represents and expresses all the criminality, social inequality. I mean, in everything that everything that the administration is doing in response, it reflects social interests, class interests. And the fact is the Democratic Party expresses, well, perhaps different factions, the same class interests. And, again, over the past 3 years, what has been the focus of the Democratic Party? It hasn't been on addressing urgent social needs and threats. It's been upon the threat posed by Vladimir Putin, which has been utilized by the Democratic Party to advance its own right-wing militarist agenda. As for what it's doing, I mean, the bill that was passed in Congress, which, by the way, it's not just $1,200, it's also expanded unemployment benefits, which will go to broader sections of workers and young people. But these are all stopgap measures. They're measures which are aimed at ameliorating social explosion in an immediate sense, while the ruling class prepares its response. But one has to approach politics in class terms, not the sort of politics of wishful thinking. If I just add on that, I think one of the lessons which has to be drawn also here is the experience of the Sanders campaign, because millions of workers and young people supported Sanders in this election, in the hopes that this represented somehow a movement against social inequality. But the role of Sanders was and is to channel all of that behind the Democratic Party. I think it's a striking fact that under conditions in which this pandemic is really, it's concretely exposing the consequences of capitalism and the necessity for socialism, it's at this point that Sanders is beginning to wrap up his campaign. He's made clear that he's not going to continue. And if you listen to what he's saying, in addition to voting for this bill that passed in Congress, he says nothing about capitalism, nothing about socialism, proposing really minor reforms without any challenge to the dictatorship of the corporations, of the ruling class over social and economic life. And I think these are the deeper conclusions. David said at the beginning, a serious socialism, not a socialism of Marx and Lenin and Trotsky, not a socialism, a pseudo-socialism, which promotes the idea that something is going to be done within the framework of the Democratic Party, which is the socialism of Sanders or Corbyn or Syriza, and of course the Democratic Socialists of America. That this sort of Democratic Party politics is proven bankrupt, and a different type of politics has to be developed in the working class.
I would like to
Go ahead, David.
add a few points to the question which was asked about the bailout and its significance. Now, I've stressed a number of times that the pandemic, for all its intrinsic significance, should be viewed somewhat as a trigger event. And that applies to an understanding of the economic convulsion that has developed, the crisis which has developed very rapidly, which is, of course, a fundamental element of this situation. Now, even apart from the pandemic, there were many indications, and certainly the World Socialist website has written about it extensively and continuously. There are many indications that the United States and the world, the whole world capitalist system, was hurtling toward a major economic upheaval. And in this regard, it is striking that the massive fall in the markets have taken place with staggering speed. And I don't believe, despite last week's slight recovery in the markets, that will persist. The economic breakdown has certainly been accelerated and intensified by the pandemic. It's given its a sort of special speed. But this crisis has, like everything else, far deeper roots. It's always a question of how far back do you want to go. But since there was a reference to Obama and his presidency, it may come as a shock to some, but perhaps Trump is somewhat more vulgar and more backward. But in many ways, his own administration is a continuation and has continued many of the policies which were put into place by Obama. Keep in mind that the last great economic collapse took place a little more than a decade ago. And the measures which were employed to get out of that collapse, which was triggered by Wall Street fraud and so on, involved a massive infusion of credit, of liquidity into the American and global economy. I mean, the Federal Reserve, and under the auspices of what was called quantitative easing bailed out the investor class to the tune of hundreds of trillions of dollars. Quantitative easing involved buying corporate and rotten bank assets to the tune of $80 billion a month. That's gone on for year after year. Interest rates were kept at historically low levels. And so the whole process of intervening to save the capitalist class was initiated, I would say initiated, but was taken in 2008, 2009 to a new level by the Obama administration. And this playbook was written by that administration, the Trump administration, with the enthusiastic support of the Republicans and the Democrats who were cheering the passage of the bill, have continued this. Now, again, I'd just like to point out, for those who are interested in these issues, we all have heard the traditional justification for capitalism and of what does the capitalist do? He brings to the market his capital, he invests, and he takes the risk. Well, as it turns out, the money he brings to the market is money provided by the government. And when everything goes wrong, risk is carried by the population as a whole. He doesn't have any risk at all. He's bailed out. And the trillions which are being now poured into the corporations, I think everyone should keep in mind that all of this money, which will be used to sustain the corporate salaries, which will be used to sustain their lifestyle, which will be used to cover their losses, all of this is being provided by the population. Now, we also are familiar, the claims, that capitalism, the state must stay out of the affairs of capitalism. State intervention is anti-capitalist, anti-American. Well, of course, when things begin to go south, then the cry goes up. They want the state to intervene and provide them with money, lots of money. Now, what are the conclusions which should be drawn? In the end, when we look at the present situation, and I think it's extremely important for understanding also the demands which are now going up for everyone to get back to work as quickly as possible. The process of the economic system of the last decade and more, but particularly during the past decade, has been characterized by a process which economists, more critical economists, have referred to as financialization, where a vast portion of the profits accumulated are generated not through the process of production, but in the finance industry. I think the finance industry now accounts for something like 60% of corporate profits. Now, this growing separation of the process of wealth accumulation, bluntly, the creation of billionaires and multi-billionaires, has been more and more separated from the actual process of production. That is the process of production which requires the application of the labor process. And that has reached the most extreme forms. And now, to some extent, this separation of production from wealth accumulation could be concealed as long as you have, to some extent, production still taking place, or the economic life proceeding. But now you have a situation where quite suddenly there is no production taking place, the economy is shutting down, and the hollowness of the entire economic system is being graphically exposed. Now, for some time, they can try to conceal this by pouring liquidity into the corporations, or the usual handouts, even on a more extreme form, but it can't continue. And so the call which is now going up, that everybody has to get back to work as quickly as possible, regardless of the health consequences, is in its own way a confirmation of the Marxist theory of value. Without the application of labor, in the final analysis, there is no wealth to be produced. So the masses have to get back to work to keep the system operating, or at least to provide enough value coming into the economy to provide a certain level of support for the wealth which is levitating above the real labor process. So, even in the most fundamental sense, the way this crisis has so rapidly developed is a powerful confirmation of Marxism. It's a demonstration of the bankruptcy of capitalism, and it leads to the following important conclusion. The capitalists want their state to intervene to defend them, to provide, to plunder the society, to pour more and more resources into their bank accounts. The working class has to create its own state power. It has to fight to acquire political power and use a genuinely democratic worker state to organize in a rational, scientific manner society in the interests of humanity as a whole, to end the chaos which we now are observing. I mean, it is extraordinary. Here we are in 2020, sheltered, wherever, in our homes, if we're fortunate, our apartments, and there are many far less fortunate. And the society with all the billions and trillions incapable of dealing with an emergency. And I just want to, I'm sorry to go on a bit, but we've had meetings, and one question which often comes up is, well, what about the pandemic of 1918, 1919, where millions and millions died? Well, the difference then was the level of science was nowhere near what it is today. The knowledge of virology, the knowledge of how epidemics spread. No one knew about DNA or RNA, microbiology involved in these pathogens. And so, but here we are 100 years later with a far higher level of scientific knowledge, the ability to predict, to make projections, to understand. And there are countless graphs to be found how these pathogens spread. We know precisely. And there's work available on the internet, papers, which everyone can consult, which show that every hour, every day of a delayed response translates into countless tens of thousands of lives. And yet with all that knowledge, this society was totally unprepared. So I think, we're dealing with so many fundamental questions which can't be answered by the banalities, not just of the capitalist media, but the type of warmed over semi-reformism, empty phrases about Medicare for all, which are handed out by people who have absolutely no idea of what is involved in a serious transformation of economic and social life, such as what we now need.
Well, David, you covered a lot of topics in that response, which I thought was really excellent. But I think that I just wanted to ask a few follow-up questions from our listeners online about some of the economic issues and historical issues that you raised. And then maybe we can address some of the questions of organizing the working class in response to this. There have been a number of questions raised in that regard. But just first on the economic issues, Liam asks, does the economic collapse that is occurring during this pandemic have anything to do with the deeper structural issues of capitalism? I mean, obviously, you've pointed to some of those, but I think perhaps you could elaborate. Another viewer asks, how can the QE money printing program of the Fed not cause inflation? If it just reinflates asset prices, doesn't that affect the real economy at all? Maybe you wanted to take those?
Well, perhaps I'll just say a few words, then maybe Joe wants to deal with it. Well, that's a very good question. There's an article which appeared in the New York Times by historian Adam Tooze, who actually wrote, well, everything could be solved if we just have enough dollars available to provide and cover the demand for liquidity. That he was pointing last 2 weeks, there's been a tremendous demand for dollars. And he refers to the dollar as a store of value. Well, a store of value of what? How is that determined? I mean, the fact of the matter is running the digital printing presses, creating more dollars doesn't by itself create value. Value is created in the labor process. What is being created are claims on value. It used to be said that the definition of inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. Well, now one has a situation where you have trillions of dollars being produced in the forms of credits, in the forms of digital transfers, alterations of bank balance sheets, and nothing standing behind it. So yes, it has ultimately colossal inflationary implications. And the disastrous consequences of this are going to continue and manifest themselves. And the point I was trying to make before is the increasing angry and ruthless demands for a return to work reflects this recognition within the ruling elite that they require a return to the process of labor exploitation at an ever more intense level to cover some portion of the claims on value which they are manufacturing in the forms of essentially currency inflation.
Well, I just perhaps Joe could speak a bit more on some of these issues as well. I had a few questions I wanted to direct to him from some of our listeners. But I just wanted to first off thank those of our listeners who have just donated. For those of you who have not yet donated, I would like to encourage you to go to wsws.org/donate. You can make a donation there. Or you can, if you're listening on the WSWS, there will be a link to donate directly on the page. So, Joe, I wanted to turn to you to follow up on some of the points that David raised. Specifically, he spoke about Trump's demand for a return to work. One listener asks, can you elaborate a bit more on the talk of going back to work? What must be the answer of the working class to this? Two more questions. Joe asks, can you comment on the demand for workplace and neighborhood committees, the limitations of spontaneity, and the need for such committees to take up politics? And finally, Mark asks, if working from home, can we use this crisis to agitate our co-workers to make demands of our supervisors, administration, and raise their class consciousness?
Well, just first to address some of those questions, and then make a point about the earlier one. I mean, the response of the working class to this has to be to reject it. The demand which comes from Trump and from powerful sections of the financial oligarchy that workers get back to work pumping out profits with no regard for their safety. Trump, with just inestimable contempt at his press conference where he was talking about this the other day, said, oh, well, we're going to send workers back, but don't worry, we'll have social distancing measures. We'll be encouraging workers to wash their hands and not shake hands with other workers, as if that's going to resolve the issue. And of course, auto workers reporting that they know that, I mean, these plants, often they don't even have running water, hot water, soap. I mean, the conditions of work are really horrific. And you have the situation in Amazon where Bezos declared, the wealthiest person in the United States declared, one of them, declared that, well, Amazon workers are not going to have face masks or gloves. We just don't have them, but they have to continue working. And the working class has to fight. It has to fight to insist that there will be no non-essential production, that is production which is not essential to the functioning of society, health care, and other social needs, that there will not be essential production until this virus is under control. And that where production must continue, it be under safe conditions. And of course, that takes particular expression in the hospitals and the healthcare professionals who criminally do not have access to basic protective equipment. And it really is criminal that healthcare workers are being forced to work under these conditions. And many are already coming down with coronavirus. But the working class has to respond. It has to advance and fight for its interests. The question of the formation of committees is really critical. The utilization of technologies, social media, to communicate with other workers is very powerful. This is an opportunity for workers to really fight to develop lines of communication, not just within their own industry, but across industries, not just in one country, but internationally. The development of organizations through which workers can fight for their interests. But to get to that last question, I mean, that has to be connected to a political program, a program that fights for a transformation of society, that fights to replace this government of the corporate and financial oligarchy with a workers' government, that will defend the interests of workers, the nationalization or the transformation into public utilities under democratic control and social ownership of all of the major corporations. They shouldn't be bailed out. They should be turned into public utilities. The transformation of the financial sector into a publicly run institution, run on the basis of social need, not private profit. The expropriation of the oligarchs that control this society. So that we have to develop and fight for a socialist program and connect the mobilization and development of the class struggle with the fight for socialism. If I could just make one point in relationship to the issues that David was raising about printing of money. I agree with everything that he said. I think it's remarkable in one of the latest issues of Jacobin, one of the main publications of the Democratic Socialists of America, affiliated with the DSA. First of all, it's a completely demoralized piece, which concludes in its introduction that if Bernie Sanders doesn't win, all hope for socialism is lost for decades to come. It says, if the movement coalescing behind Sanders fails to win this time, there's no guarantee it can be resuscitated under a new banner. In fact, it's just as likely that it will be left adrift for decades, for years, if not decades. But then in their article on the likelihood of socialism and how it's going to be implemented under Bernie Sanders administration, they specifically make the argument, extraordinary as it is, that socialism is impossible in America, and they only deal with it within the United States, a completely nationalist perspective. And the reason that it's possible is that the Federal Reserve can print unlimited supplies of money. They write, the power of the dollar allows the Federal Reserve to directly control international interest rates, which it does simply by adjusting its own. And its flows of credit have been the principal way of undermining democracy elsewhere to reshape economies in its own interests. But that same power affords it significant capacity to adopt a more just approach to growth. A modest proposal for achieving socialism through the U.S. Federal Reserve and by the printing of dollars. I mean, it really is, but it's an expression of sort of the bankruptcy of this type of politics that is around the Democratic Party.
Well, Joe, I think those are extremely important points. I just wanted to return to this issue of whether this pandemic could have been foreseen and prepared for. And specifically, I wanted to point to the coverage of the World Socialist website. The WSWS identified quite early on that this is an event of very substantial global significance. Even in January, the World Socialist website wrote in a perspective that, quote, the outbreak in China has exposed the vulnerability of contemporary society to new strains of infectious disease and the dangers for which no capitalist government anywhere in the world has adequately prepared. I think that's being played out in spades and horrifically being demonstrated before the eyes of millions of people. David, maybe you could comment on why the World Socialist website has, from the beginning, paid such attention to this pandemic.
Well, I would, in a general sense, we try to study, and we do study objective events. I think from what everyone has said, we are materialists. We recognize the existence of an objective reality. And the World Socialist website, I should also add, has been always very much oriented to the careful study of developments in culture and science, climate change. And again, to come back to the point that what we've seen in the pandemic, this is only a foretaste in the sense of what the implications of climate change are. But we know we not only we're following the developments, there was a great deal of information available, and we wrote about it, and that analysis that we presented has proven to be correct. I think it's striking that the World Socialist website, which proceeds from a global view and which recognizes that today all great social events, first of all, are mass events, they are global events. We could bring to the analysis of this development, we could recognize that what was happening in China would inevitably have far-reaching implications throughout the world. and also to the extent that we're not mesmerized by the propaganda of the capitalist media, that we have a very clear and developed perspective and political orientation, enables us to respond, I think, in a very acute way to such events.
Well, I just wanted to bring in Johannes for his interpretation of these questions. Johannes, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I hope the connection is working again. I switched off my camera.
Sounds quite a bit better. Go ahead, Johannes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think a lot of important points have been raised. I just want to, maybe talk a bit more about some of the very same developments in Europe. I mean, this back to work campaign by Trump was mentioned. That's also a very aggressive now campaign developing in Europe. I think it's important to understand, and that point was made, that there is an objective logic underlying this call to send workers back to work, even under conditions where the pandemic is really intensifying and more people become infected and are dying. And it's very clearly explained by those who advance it. We wrote an article about a German finance investor who is very aggressive in making this demand. And he said explicitly, basically what we as Marxists explain, that to pursue this economic policy of money printing and handing out bailouts to the banks and the big corporations, workers have to get back to work. You can't sustain these type of programs, which means basically enriching the super rich, if workers are just sitting at home and are not doing anything. And this is becoming now, a real dangerous development. The point was made that in the end, the ruling class will use force to implement these type of policies. There was yesterday a plan revealed by the German government that 15,000 troops are now mobilized or will be mobilized in the next days all over the country. And it's already clear that these soldiers will not just be used to help with the medical supplies for the population, but they will mainly be there to work with the police, to basically police the population. So this drive to, the question which I think we are discussing, the whole development has revealed that there is massive state intervention needed to confront the pandemic. The whole basically capitalist myth that there are such things as liberal capitalist entrepreneurship and the state has to play no role. This is over. The whole crisis has shown that the banks and the corporations cannot really exist and survive without massive state intervention. But that, of course, raises the whole question: who holds state power? Who controls the available resources? Is it the financial oligarchy, which increasingly turns to dictatorship and fascistic methods, or is the working class able to take state power, to use the resources which are available to organize a scientific, a rational plan to build what is necessary? We talked about the question of ventilators, the hospitals which are needed. All these processes are, of course, now becoming very sharp, and I think it's very correct that we are saying there is really a revolutionary development is being prepared. I mean, consciousness of people is changing. People are radicalized. Workers are politicized. I think it's all right, to also mention that the World Socialist website actually has a huge increase in readership under these conditions, despite the censorship. And the whole question is, of course, now to fight for socialist consciousness in the working class, to develop a historical understanding of what is happening. That's what we're doing with this meeting, and really to build our international party, organize the working class internationally on the basis of a socialist program, and make it possible that the solution of the crisis is not left to the ruling class, but the working class is able to advance its own program. That's now becoming, as we have said in many perspectives, a life and death question. So I also want to make the appeal for everyone who's listening in to think through these questions very carefully and join our party.
Okay, well, I just wanted to raise a number of questions that have come up online in terms of the programmatic response of the Socialist Equality Party. Of course, Joe Kishore is running as our candidate. I think perhaps he might address some of these questions, as well as Dr. Mateos. Feel free to jump in and take some of these questions up. So some of the questions that have come up, for instance, Wachira asks, curfew, quarantine, or total lockdown? What is the most effective way of stopping new COVID-19 infections? New cases are being reported in almost all countries. Taisha asks, what do the SEP demands mean in practical terms? And there's another question. Can you explain your party's demands in response to this crisis? What is a genuine socialist society? And how would a genuinely socialist society respond to this pandemic? I'd also like to ask, just one question that maybe you can reply to, because I know this has come up a lot in questions that people have submitted on the WSWS material that we posted. I mean, is it actually possible to contain this pandemic? Are masses of the population, is it inevitable that vast numbers of the population will be infected and that millions will die? Or is another course possible?
I will interject my comments, and I think everyone should make statements as to what's happening. I know we've discussed this broadly, but repeatedly, the World Health Organization and various, even the Imperial College, has noted that to get this pandemic under control, some form of social distancing, school closures, banning of mass gatherings, stop non-essential work has to go into effect, and it has to be abroad. It can't be just piecemeal. But the issue of testing has been brought up, and how the CDC and the HHS and FDA have completely humbled this. It's a leadership issue, and without testing, as we've said before, you're fighting blind. You don't know where this pandemic is spreading. So, but the testing to identify who is infected or isn't, it needs to be employed in a manner to trace and isolate the contact in order to bring it to a stop. This is much more economical than allowing some herd immunity to take place, which is especially euthanasia. It's allowing people to die without trying. Fundamentally, the role of public health is to address these issues, but there is no coordinated effort. And as to another point that one of the questioners had asked, the U.S. healthcare system works as a business, and so it works to maintain full capacity at minimal number of healthcare workers, straining the healthcare systems to its maximum capacity to extract surplus value and profits out of it. So any strain on the system will make it collapse, and it's not designed to help society. It's designed to make money.
Joe, did you want to speak on the demands of the SEP in response to this?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, those points are absolutely correct, and measures can and must be taken to stop the spread of this, to limit its impact as much as possible, to care for those who are sick, to provide secure and healthy work conditions. There are emergency measures, and all the epidemiologists and healthcare professionals insist upon this, that have to be taken. But it always comes back to the fact that what is driving the actions of the state, it's not being treated fundamentally as a healthcare crisis, but as an economic problem, and specifically a market problem. That is their concern. And then, of course, it's all refracted through the enormous levels of social inequality. So the rich, they can fly off to their villas and wherever and have access to the best healthcare, but it's another story for the working class. On the question of demands, I mean, the SCP, the Socialist Equality Party, including in our election campaign, is fighting for a serious response to this pandemic. We demand that there be a stop to all non-essential production, that a massive program for the building up of healthcare infrastructure, equipment, the reorientation of production from non-essential items to those which are necessary to stop this pandemic and treat those who are being affected by it. Of course, there has to be full income for all those who are laid off. 3.3 million people filed unemployment benefits last week in the United States alone. The consequences of this for tens and tens of millions of people all over the world is going to be disastrous. The income has to be guaranteed. And the working class has to fight for this. It has to fight for, we insist that, they're still constructing high-rise luxury buildings in New York City amidst this disaster. They should be constructing such buildings. They should be devoted to healthcare infrastructure, and those buildings should be seized and repurposed for providing homes for the homeless and others who are severely impacted by this. So there has to be a fight for such a program. But the point that has to be stressed is that the working class has to mobilize independently. It has to organize around such demands and fight for them. And at every point, the realization of such demands comes into conflict with the interests of the corporate and financial elite. It raises the necessity for the seizure of the giant corporations, turning them into public utilities run on the basis of social need. It comes into conflict with this financial oligarchy that runs society. Their wealth must be confiscated and redirected to meet the needs of the population. Massive sums which have been accumulated. And it poses a necessity for a political fight against capitalism and for socialism in the United States and internationally. So we fight for these demands, but we fight on the basis of connecting them to a socialist program and an understanding that we fight for such a program in order to raise the consciousness of the working class as to what it really confronts and what it must fight for, and to develop its independent organization and political struggle. If I could just answer the question finally on the issue of quarantine, which is raised in one of the questions. A pandemic like this requires emergency responses. Under a socialist society, the development of such an epidemic would require all scientific measures to be taken to block its spread. And there, where necessary, there may be have to be quarantines, although that has to be done on the basis of guaranteeing the democratic rights and the social interests of those impacted. But the danger is, because this state is not responding on the basis of the interests of actually containing the pandemic or the interests of the working class. It represents the interests of the corporate and financial elite. And the workers have to be on guard against the utilization of emergency measures justified on the basis of this pandemic that undermine basic democratic rights. Most recently, you have the threat from Donald Trump to quarantine all of New York, New Jersey, and parts of Connecticut, basically preventing anyone from going in and going out. And I think this is very chilling. It comes in the context in which Trump is denouncing state governments that he doesn't agree with and threatening basically to cut off aid to entire states because of the political conflicts. It's developing into an immense political crisis in the United States. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said in response to this threat, well, this means that the federal government is declaring war on the states. But I think what's raised is, you do have within this context the danger of the utilization on the part of the state of emergency measures under the cover of measures necessary to stop a pandemic in order to implement significant attacks on democratic rights. We say in our response to our latest, or at the end of our latest statement, that the response of the ruling class to this leads in the direction of authoritarianism, of social inequality, and the deaths of millions of people. The response of the working class, however, and this is the critical question, leads in the direction of socialism. And that's what the working class has to fight for. I would just add, we really encourage everyone to join the Socialist Equality Party. On the side of the screen, you should see a form. Get involved, join the Socialist Equality Party, sign up now. We're building a political leadership in the working class. We want you to join in the United States, all over the world, fill out your information, and make the decision to take up this fight to build a socialist leadership in the working class.
Thank you, Joe, for that answer. David, did you want to add anything to Joe's response?
Well, yes, Joe has raised very critical elements of our program. I just want to again place this perhaps in a broader historical framework, and particularly in relationship to the history of our party and what it represents. The Fourth International was founded in 1938 by Trotsky, and the outcome of his struggle against the betrayal of the October Revolution and the degeneration of the Soviet Union under the Stalinist dictatorship. Now, the founding document of the Fourth International was entitled The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. It was written by Trotsky in 1938 on the eve of the Second World War, the impending catastrophe that was ultimately to result in the death of somewhere between 50 and 70 million people, which included such horrors as the Holocaust, the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and other unspeakable events, the firebombing of Dresden, which took place just 80 years ago, last month, killing 100,000 people in one evening, two evenings. I just want to say, though, a few things about the transitional. It became the program became known as the transitional program. Transitional in the sense of the program for an epoch of transition from capitalism to socialism. Now, the underlying conception of this program was that the program of a revolutionary party, of a socialist party, must be based not on the existing consciousness of the masses, but rather on objective reality. And at the same time, however, it has to find a way of relating and clarifying or establishing a link between the conditions facing the masses, their contemporary struggles, and the goal of socialism. And this is the significance of transitional demands. Underlying these transitional demands was that at every point, the demands began not with what the capitalists claimed they could or could not afford, but the objective needs of the workers, both in a practical and historical sense. The fight for the program was an inseparable element or critical element in the education of the working class, the raising of its consciousness, and the development of a genuine solution to the historical cataclysm which the masses faced. Now, everything that's been said here and everything which has emerged from the crisis as it continues to unfold is that clearly the fight against the pandemic, the fight for an appropriate response to this pandemic, cannot be based on what the capitalists say they can or cannot afford. Frankly, we couldn't care less. We're not interested in what J.P. Morgan, Chase, or any other corporation tells us is or is not possible. The government, the corporations express the interests of an oligarchy. And in the most direct sense, this crisis demonstrates that the striving for profit and the defense of human life are irreconcilably contradictory objectives. General Motors, which has now been tasked, for God's sakes, with the building of ventilators. Can you imagine? General Motors and they're haggling with the government over how much money they're going to make to produce this. Well, obviously, our response would be that the corporations, General Motors and all the other multi-billion-dollar corporations, be expropriated and the resources be organized and utilized in a manner which can facilitate mass production of all that is needed under safe conditions to protect and save human life. So we're talking about nationalization without compensation to the big shareholders, but nationalization, and you might say internationalization, under the democratic control of the American and the world's population. Similarly, there's no way one can organize the resources of society without placing the banks, which always come cap in hand whenever they're on the verge of bankruptcy, placing the banks under public control, centralizing the banks, and again expropriating the large shareholders, and ditto for the enormous, obscene fortunes which have been accumulated. I think we should be generous. I think we should take some cognizance of the very hard work that Mr. Bezos has done. But I think if he can't, maybe we'll leave him with $20 or $30 million, just as an example of unnecessary, grotesque wealth, as a moral tale to be looked upon with a certain amount of disgust. But the vast resources which exist, as I'm making a point as clearly as I can, must be placed under public control. Now, most immediately, since this issue has come up of a return to work, we say no return to work under conditions in which human life is threatened. No worker should be asked or compelled to work under unsafe conditions in which their lives are threatened. And in those key industries, which are tasked with saving human life, making available critical life-saving goods, food, and so on, all resources must be provided to make sure that those workers work in safe conditions. Healthcare workers should not be expected to sacrifice their lives due to the absence of critically required equipment. And of course, an element of this is, we know that the state of production in the United States is so catastrophically disorganized that ventilators will not be available for months, if not years. So we desperately need international collaboration. We should be working with our brothers and sisters in all parts of the world to organize the production of ventilators, masks, or whatever else is needed, pharmaceuticals, medicines. There should be globally coordinated research to accelerate the discovery of a appropriate and at least somewhat effective response, ultimately a full response to this particular pandemic outbreak. So the principle, if many details can be filled in, but the most critical detail is that there can be no solution to this and the crises which are to come. And the pandemic is only a focus of a broad range of existential threats to humanity. None of these can be met unless the working class is organized to take power, supported by the most progressive sections of the middle class, the intelligentsia, the broad mass of youth who are into the working class, to reorganize society and create a society which serves the needs of the people, and that we can finally put behind us a stage of history of class oppression, where wealth is concentrated in the hands of a tiny minority of the population. That's the only realistic program in our epoch.
Dr. Mateos, would you like to comment on those points that David just made?
Sure, thank you. I want to agree with David's comments. I wanted to maybe highlight a point for technology. I think that we had discussed this earlier. In this pandemic, there's been on social media vast groups of healthcare workers who organized to share best practices, discuss what is working and what's not working, share experiences so that healthcare workers who are going to face the pandemic, so the surge appears, and be prepared for it, unlike anything that health officials or governments are sharing with them. But also which speaks to this desire for workers to coordinate their work together in an effort to help humanity as opposed to worrying about the profit. But what also is arising from this work is that more and more nurses and doctors are fearing retribution should they criticize their hospital or state officials or health authorities about the lack of personal protective equipment or face masks, which goes much more broadly into the sinister nature of censorship and the ability to critique openly the wrongs that exist. And I think I wanted to highlight these. And I just wanted to thank the World Socialist website for allowing me to participate.
So one final question before we conclude this program. Of course, we know that the outbreak of the global pandemic has been accompanied by growing interest in international socialism, which of course has been growing over the course of the past several years, and in particular the past several months. But this has expressed itself in a growing readership for the World Socialist website, particularly among broad sections of workers. David, could you maybe speak about the significance of some of these developments?
Well, yes. Well, we have been publishing the World Socialist website now for 22 years, and steadily built up our cadre of writers, broadened the global reach and influence of the World Socialist website, and despite the ever-increasing efforts of such platforms as such search engines as Google or Reddit to suppress the World Socialist website, we have been experiencing a steady and now very considerable growth. I know just in the past month, or in this month, our readership is well over 1 million individual readers, over 2 million pages accessed. I think you have now a graph which has shown the growth of the World Socialist website. It also shows the global stature. I think we're now 17,000 in global websites, and in the top 5,000 websites in the United States. Now, of course, these things go up and down. That's not our central focus. Our main concern is to translate this ever greater readership into supporters, active supporters, and of course, into members. But there are certain elements in these figures which are significant, and which we tend to look at from the standpoint of analyzing. When we analyze our figures, it isn't so much from the standpoint of our immediate success, but what does it tell us about the social forces which are being activated? Now, we know that a very, very significant portion of the surge in our readership has come from the working class. The fact that our readership has been growing substantially relative to publications which cater to the middle class pseudo left. I'm not going to mention the names of publications. Some of them find themselves going out of business at the present time. But many of these publications, which have focused on issues such as identity, race, the continuous obsession with gender, these publications appeal to a very different audience than we do. We're not really in competition with them in that sense. Our audience is the working class within the United States and internationally. I've been particularly heartened and, in fact, enthusiastic about the tremendous growth in the readership of the World Socialist website in German. It is really experiencing a meteoric growth in the last month, and particularly in Germany, with its terrible history of fascism, authoritarian rule, and the most violent war waged by its ruling class against Marxism. This has tremendous significance, and I'm really immensely gratified by the success that our German comrades are now having. We also see that there's a substantial growth of the website and its readership in Brazil, in South America, in Asia, of course, in Sri Lanka, in India, the growth in Australia, and we begin to get letters in from readers in virtually every continent. So this is for us an extremely important indication of a process of political radicalization. It places upon us tremendous challenges. I'm, as the chairperson of the International Editorial Board, I'm very proud of the daily collaboration of our website. The editorial board meets and discusses each day, works out the political line, which we will have. And the efforts made by so many writers who participate and who contribute so much time and effort to producing the website. It is very challenging. We are in a process of preparing a expanded and more developed form of our website. I hope that will be launched in the very near future. But above all, the website is not, we've always conceived of the website as a political, intellectual, theoretical center of socialist thought. We view socialism not just as a list of demands. Socialism is a great political and cultural movement of the working class. We write and we strive to write at a high level. We believe that the education of the working class is the only means by which great historic change can take place. And so the response, which we've seen in the recent period, is very important. And I think it's only the beginning of a far, far greater development. Historic problems require great, profound, revolutionary solutions. And so that is our ambition. And I again want to make this point. Let's use the period right now, the period of, you might say, enforced isolation. Let's turn this into a period of preparation to all our working class readers and youth, and form networks. At some point, you'll be going back to work. And when you go back to work, you want to be prepared for what you are going to face. You must now organize networks of support, rank and file committees to monitor conditions in the shop floor, in your offices, in your factories. You have to have a leadership which is committed, which you've all seen the bankruptcy of the trade unions, the corruption. You have to use this period now to organize and create networks of trusted and respected socialist leaders who can prepare for the enormous struggles that lie ahead.
Just finally, Johannes, did you want to weigh in on any of these points that David just addressed?
Well, I think, in fact, it was a very good summation of what we have to do. I just want to say that I support what has been outlined at the end. I think the decisive question is now really to build the Fourth International, the ICFI, as the leadership in the working class. We are doing this under conditions, as we have discussed, where there's an explosive growth of the class struggle underway. It must be underway. This can't be sustained, that billions go to the banks, to the super rich, and on the other hand, workers are now told to go back to work under conditions where you have a deadly pandemic ripping throughout the world. Workers will draw conclusions. They will look for a political perspective. And our task is now really to build a leadership in the working class. We have made the point that all these processes we are discussing, the drive towards dictatorship, on the one hand, the drive towards war, but also on the other hand, of course, the drive towards growing struggles in the working class, that was very much underway and developed in the past year. We have remarked that the big problem is, and it still remains, of course, that there is not a leadership in the working class to lead these struggles. But I think now the conditions are really developing to do this. I think one indication of the huge social differentiation which is building up between the working class And the bourgeoisie is also the development of the pseudo-left parties. Already some points about Sanders have been made. It's a similar development in Europe. I just want to make maybe a brief point on the left party. They voted now openly in the parliament with the grand coalition, with the government, for this basically new rescue package for the banks. It's of course not surprising. They have already in 2008 and 9 in backroom deals supported the bailouts for the banks. Then of course you had Syriza in power in Greece implementing the social austerity with the far-right party, Arnel, the independent Greeks. And you had now recently here even a very, I think eye-opening development when the left party began to collaborate with the far-right AfD in Thuringia, and the left party minister president, Bodo Ramelow, voted in the state parliament for an AfD politician to become the vice president of the state parliament. So that's how big the gulf is now between our movement, the socialist movement, and those pseudo-left parties. And workers will see this. And maybe it's an important point one could make. I think everyone should read the statement we published at the beginning of the year under the headline, "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." And at the very end, we make this point about revolutionary leadership, and we outline the tasks of the ICFI. We end with a quote by Trotsky, as he was concluding the founding document of the Fourth International, which was mentioned in the discussion by David, where he said, "Workers, men and women of all countries, place yourselves under the banner of the Fourth International. It's the banner of your approaching victory." I think that has to be the battle cry in the next period for us, for the working class internationally. And so I think this online meeting we have been holding must really be the starting point to develop our work, to organize the working class internationally, and fight for socialist consciousness in the working class to prepare for the coming struggles.
Thank you for those points, Johannes. We're approaching the end of our program. I just wanted to ask if there were any final concluding remarks from any of our participants before I wrap up.
Well,
okay. Go ahead.
I hope that this program has helped clarify the program of our party. Again, we urge everyone who is listening to read the World Socialist website, become active in the work of our movement, to support it, and to make the most critical decision you can make, to become an active fighter for socialism. When this immediate crisis is past us, or at least its most acute stage in terms of the pandemic, we are able to resume something approaching a normal life. It can't be the old life, and it can't be the old way. This world must change, and there cannot be any return to things as they were. This isn't the last crisis. This isn't the last existential threat. The basic reality is that the future is either socialism or it's the destruction of humanity, the destruction of this planet. The experience which we are now going through is a terrible, terrible warning. And so we have to learn from it. And we have to act upon those lessons. And with that, I ask you to all over the world, become active in the socialist equality parties, which are affiliated with the International Committee of the Fourth International. Build this movement, commit your life to it. And finally, in the weeks and months ahead, stay safe, take care of your health. We need you in the fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for those remarks. And thank you to all of our participants in this forum, everyone viewing and listening online. We enormously appreciate your support. Over the course of this program, we've received a significant number of donations. We'd like to thank all of those who donated and encourage you to set up recurring donations to the World Socialist website to help support the fight for socialism, the daily reporting of the World Socialist website from all over the world. If you have not yet donated, you can do so by going to wsws.org/donate, or you can simply click on the donate button if you're watching this event on the World Socialist website. I would also like all of you to take up the appeal made by David North and to get involved in the struggle for socialism. You can click to sign up on the page in which you're watching this event to join the Socialist Equality Party. I think that the pandemic has exposed that the fact that the mobilization of the working class is a question of life and death. I would encourage all of you to join this struggle, join this fight, and find out more about joining the Socialist Equality Party. With that, I'd like to conclude, and thank you all very much.